Unfortunately, there's collusion often in organizations. We see people, we say they're getting close to retirement, we'll let them ride it out, we won't talk to them about it, we'll let them go, they'll retire and they'll leave. Instead of saying, this person's, in that direction, we got to have a conversation with them. We've got to have more dialogue about this. Is this really what you want? Do you just want to coast to retirement and leave? Or do you want to find another assignment in here or find us a way to re-energize you and re-engage you with this work? Maybe you need some training. Maybe there's something we need to do. And these are not conversations we have in organizations today.
I'll tell you, senior executives in most organizations today do not have a clue about the knowledge walking out the door of their company. What isn't talked about, but what NASA will admit, if you probe a little bit, is that we cannot go to the moon today, right now, if we had to. In fact, we lost most of the knowledge from those Apollo missions. Specifically, we lost the ability to build the Saturn V rocket. The engineers who built that rocket were retired out of NASA in the 90s, and we lost the blueprints. No kidding. I tell that story at the beginning of my book, Lost Knowledge, because it crystallizes an assumption that we hold in our society today, that once we achieve a level of performance in our organizations using complex knowledge, that we can always sustain that level of performance. And I'm here to tell you that's not true. Unless we find ways to capture, transfer, and retain the critical capabilities that we have developed in our healthcare systems, we are not going to be able to retain that level of capability. Another example was a utility company. This is a utility in the Midwest that had been growing coming into the recession. In fact, they had plans for new power plants on the board. They had started quite elaborate programs to develop the next generation of utility workers because, like healthcare, they probably have the problem even worse, as you'll see in a few minutes. They had reached down into high schools. They had partnerships going with schools to bring kids into the industry, to start training them in local community colleges. They were doing, elaborate management development programs, and they had quite an elaborate talent management program in place. And they basically shut it down with the recession. So now they're worried about, are we losing every month? Are we losing ground? Because these problems aren't going away. And how do we restart this whole talent management process, as we come out of the recession, as our demand picks up? And the last bullet point here is intended to show you that this is a global problem. Germany's workforce is going to shrink 20% in the next 20 years. Germany, Italy, Spain, and Japan all have considerably worse demographics than we do here in the US. So this is a global issue. So if you think you're going to go abroad necessarily and be finding replacements abroad, you're going to be competing again with a lot of other countries. Now, the point I always make when I show this slide is, for those of you who are kind of thinking, well, you know what, I'm sorry for those other people, but I don't really have an aging workforce issue. I've got a pretty well-distributed demographic in my workforce. I say, where do you think these people are going to come looking for great employees in the next few years when they get desperate? This is what you have to worry about, is basically the challenge of competing for good talent. Now, let me share with you also why this issue of losing experienced talent is so critical to the business and to the industry and to your hospital. All these conversations about workforce changes have to start in the context of performance goals. When you're talking to your hospital administrators, there's no point in talking about an aging workforce unless you're talking about its implications for performance and patient outcomes. Now, let me explain why this is such an issue at this time in our history. If we'd had this demographic trend of aging baby boomers or aging population 50 or 100 years from now, it would have been a different problem. How many people here remember work life before personal computers? Show of hands. Okay, well, about 2/3 of you at least. You have seen, think about it, my first personal computer was brought it into my office in 1980. It's been downhill ever since. And you think about the transformation you've seen in your work life, from work life before personal computers to what we have today, where systems underlie everything we do. Well, they're just symptomatic of the transformation that has gone on in our workplace
the unbelievable explosion of knowledge and our dependence on computer networks, and I don't mean just the stuff in your office, but the other products that you sell and work with, explosions in scientific knowledge, pharmaceutical, drug development, all aspects of science, and explosions in increases in managerial knowledge and managing distributed global operations. All this knowledge has developed and means that when people potentially leave organizations today, they leave with knowledge that didn't exist 30 years ago and that is critical to the future of the business.
Suddenly, we have this phenomenon, what I call piling up at the door. A lot of organizations tell me, we have all these people who are eligible to retire and they're not retiring. And so it's creating a new dynamic in organization which is going to have to do with utilizing even more effectively, utilizing older workers who really decide to stay on longer than you anticipated them. I think a lot of times we've forgotten what it was like to be in our 20s. And a lot of times we will attribute behavior to them. We say, oh, those Gen Ys. And it has nothing to do with them. It has to do with being 25. I had 6 employers before I was 30 years old. I was only fired from one job. Seriously, I had a very fast, but it seemed very normal. And I realized in this community there are a lot of people who who stayed with one company for many, many years. But the reality is it isn't automatically something that's just an attribute of Gen Ys. One of the things that I see that's a big concern to me when I go into organizations with an older workforce, I was in one of these, a consulting firm in the Midwest recently, and they had, everybody's in their 40s or above, and they had one 24-year-old in the company, this office. And I thought to myself, this guy's not going to last. I mean, he's got no relationship, nobody he's connecting to. So one thing Deloitte does is they form natural networks with all new employees. They make sure they get connected across the company with other people in the organization and start building social networks that will keep them engaged. Because there's plenty of data that shows people stay in places where they have friends. If they develop strong friendships, they're much more likely to stick around. This is an issue that we see across sectors. I work in healthcare, aerospace and defense, government, manufacturing, many, many different industries, and these problems are universal. As more and more older workers retire, there are fewer of you left to mentor the increasing number of younger workers, so mentors get stretched thinner and thinner, and that creates real challenges. But so we have all these changes occurring, whether it's retirements, mid-career turnover, reorganizations, and layoffs, and that creates knowledge loss that has direct strategic implications for the organization. And I argue always that these issues that we're talking about tonight, the changing workforce and knowledge transfer, always have to be discussed in a strategic context. You don't go to leadership and talk about these issues just as tactical issues. They have a direct bearing on your ability to implement your business strategy. If your strategy is around innovation, degrading your knowledge base, for the most part, seriously degrades your ability to continue to innovate in the product lines that you're talking about. Now, there are some exceptions to that. Sometimes, face it, veterans can be blocks to innovation. But that's the exception. Most of the time, we need that knowledge base to know the false trails we've already been down, the design decisions that were made, and what 10 years ago, and why we don't go that way. All the stuff that's not documented. So there's tremendous implications for innovation. Growth. You think you're going to grow a complex operation with a less skilled workforce? Example, I talked to a major chemical company a few years ago, and they said our strategic plan in the next decade is to open new chemical plants in China, in Southeast Asia. The problem is we are losing our senior chemical engineers faster than we can train them up or acquire them. And the reality is you don't open complex new chemical plants in a foreign country with a 24-year-old chemical engineer. You need experienced people who can work in a multinational environment. So if you're going to grow a part of your business, you need those resources, and that knowledge loss can undermine your ability to grow.
This is an incredibly strategic issue for many organizations. If you're a new software startup, it's not a problem. But if you're dealing with legacy knowledge, where historical knowledge about policy, history matters, knowledge about process, and knowledge about technology, and business relationships matter. It's incredibly strategic, and you need to keep talking to your senior management about it. You need to get started now, because every month you wait, every quarter you wait, reduces the options you have until my friend Colin Caddis at Rolls-Royce says, I get that call from a manager on a Friday afternoon who says, Joe, my best engineer, my last expert in this area is leaving next Wednesday. What can you do for me? And he has to tell him it's too late. And then you end up like this guy telling his board, gentlemen, after much soul searching, I've decided to take early retirement and leave you holding the bag. Thank you very much. Thank you.